The big problem with gene therapy is how do you get it to all the cells of the body you need to get it to? What's the vector or the delivery method? And they came up with the fact that you use a virus.
Before we dive in, it's important to remember that the information we provide is for informational purposes only. Every situation is unique, and decisions regarding your health or legal matters should be made after consulting with your own doctor or lawyer. Our aim is to inform and empower, but personal circumstances require personalized advice. Hi, welcome to another edition of Justice in Scrubs. I'm attorney Richard Hastings, and I'm joined by my co-host,
Dr. Jeff Michaelis.
And today we have a very interesting guest in Rob Tomeno, who is a medical writer and patient advocacy consultant. Welcome to the program, Rob.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for having me.
So can you start off by telling us what led you to work at the National Organization of Rare Diseases, and what is that organization?
So when I graduated college from the University of Richmond back in the mid-'90s, I came back to Danbury, which is my hometown, and I ended up temping at the National Organizations for Rare Disorders, which at the time was in New Fairfield, Connecticut. I was doing data entry, and they had a writer who had to quit without notice, and they didn't know how to replace them. And I said, I can write these reports. They gave me one. I wrote it. They said, this is good. They said, and they hired me. And so there was a bit of fortuitous in that. The National Organization of Rare Disorders is a voluntary health organization that's actually a membership organization. I don't know what their current membership is, but it's a collection of other health organizations that collectively work to support rare disease patients, advocate on their behalf, and work with them to find support, networking, treatments, and help them in any way they can.
So you had told me this story before, which I find fascinating. I mean, Danbury, Connecticut is not the place that you would think would be the hub for an organization such as this. So how did that organization get started?
So the organization was founded by a self-described housewife from Connecticut named Abby Myers, who at the time was living in New Fairfield. The office did move to Danbury at one point. But she had a son, and her son had symptoms that she didn't understand, and the doctors didn't know what was wrong with her son. And she didn't know what to do about it. It was affecting him in school. They were saying that he was disruptive and that he was not a good student. And they were frustrated. Her and her husband were very frustrated over it. And then one day she read an article in Parade magazine, which is the old circular that would go in the Sunday paper. I think it's still there. And there was an article about a young man in his teenage years who had Tourette syndrome. And she said to her husband, I know what our son has. The symptoms matched perfectly. She went to her doctor. The doctor agreed, said, I don't know what to do. I want to say this is late 70s. Might have been the very early 80s, late 70s. So there's no internet to go to. He had to start calling around, found that there was a specialist who dealt with Tourette in New York City. She took her son there. The doctor agreed with the diagnosis and said, it is Tourette. And said, you're actually, they gave him a treatment, but while it was effective at calming his tics and some of his other symptoms, it was like a horse tranquilizer. She said it knocked him out cold, so they needed something that could treat him but not have that negative side effect to it. There was a clinical trial for a drug that they were trying in Tourette. It was being tried for a more common condition. I don't remember which one it was. And that allowed her son through the specialist office to get medication, and that medication made a dramatic difference. It calmed him down. It didn't knock him out. He improved in school. Everything went great until she walked in the office one day and her physician said, this is the last of the medication I can give you for. This is all that's left. And she said, how what is the issue? And the doctor said, well, it failed in the clinical trial for the more common condition. So the drug company isn't going to pursue it. And she's like, wait a minute, it's really effective in Tourette syndrome. It's completely changing these kids' lives. And he said, yeah, but there's not enough people in that who have Tourette syndrome to make it viable for the companies to pursue the research and the production of the drug. And she couldn't understand that there was an effective drug for her son, but because there were too few people, the pharmaceutical industry wouldn't pursue the treatment. And the doctor said it's what rare disorders face. They're called orphan disorders because no one wants to take them because there's not a big enough population. So she decided that she could just sit there and take it, or she can go out and try to do something about it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So as a result of her interactions with her son, and I find it fascinating that her son has what's later diagnosed as Tourette syndrome.
Yep.
And she's obviously taking her son to different doctors, and nobody is saying to her, oh, your son might have or your son does have Tourette's. And basically, she diagnoses that by reading Parade magazine.
Yeah. So it was completely fortuitous. And this is, again, before the internet, before before cable TV to some extent. So Tourette, I think, is a very well-known one now. But at the time, most doctors had never seen it. And unless you go to a neurologist, even then they may not have been familiar with it. And that happens a lot in the rare disease world where the symptomology is distinct. But a regular doctor may only see one case in their lifetime, whereas a specialist who's working on a particular disorder can diagnose this right away. And the internet has helped a lot with finding the right experts and helps people. But again, it's still hard. There's a delay in diagnosis for rare disorders that I think it's 7 to 8 years, and that still exists.
Wow.
That existed in the time when Abby was first trying to help her son, and it exists now because physicians in medical school are taught a saying, and it says when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. And zebra is the unofficial mascot of the rare disease world because they're told not to go for the rare or the uncommon diagnosis, try to find the most common one. So they spend years trying to say, well, it can't be. So a lot of times if they'd simply gone out and be sent to a specialist, then maybe it would they'd get the diagnosis quicker. But it's complicated. You got to get referrals. You have insurance. Where the insurance cover? If the specialist isn't in the network, what do you do?
So Abby is no longer able to get this drug for her son. So what are the next steps that she takes?
So she began to volunteer, she had been, I think, volunteering at the Tourette Syndrome Association, which was based in New York. So she starts calling other health organizations that are represent rare disorders and said, are you aware of this problem? And some of them are, yes, we're aware of it. Others were raising money, plowing it into research, searching for treatments on their own, saying, wait a minute, if we find a viable treatment, you're telling us the pharmaceutical company won't make it? And she's like, yeah, and they had no idea. And so she then would testify and write to lawmakers to try to bring attention to this problem, and she tried to work with these other organizations to do that. There was a big change, and this is when she was contacted by a woman whose son had, I don't know if he had Tourette's or if he had another disorder, but had a treatment, and they could get the drug from Canada. But a friend was bringing it back. It's not available in the U.S., so they confiscated it. She didn't know what to do. So Abby said, write to your congressman. She was from California. Her congressman was Henry Waxman. And so Henry Waxman went and said, let's start exploring this. He realized there was a problem with rare disorders, and they tried to go out and find a solution. And then it's a pretty amazing story because in the end, it brings in Jack Klugman and the TV show Quincy in a very unexpected way. Abby goes and testifies in Los Angeles, which I believe was set up by Congressman Waxman, and there's no one there, or maybe it was in DC. D.C. I forget where it was, but anyways, no one's there. No one cared about this problem. But there was a reporter from the Los Angeles Times who wrote the story. She gets home, gets a call from Maurice Klugman, who is Jack Klugman's brother, who has a rare bone cancer, and says, we want to do something. How can we help you do it? And so they had 2 shows about the orphan drug problem on Quincy. And there's a famous scene where all these rare disease patients storm Washington, storm Capitol Hill, and it's actual rare disease patients. They actually showed up and actually filmed them. They did 2 episodes. They did one with a young man who had Tourette's, and people don't know why he's acting out and stuff like that. And then the next time they had a hearing, Jack Klugman went, and you can guess that it was completely packed because it was at the time very uncommon for a famous actor to be testifying for a law that had to do about medical stuff like that. But you've seen it now. Julia Roberts testified for Rett syndrome, which is a very rare disorder that affects that's on the X chromosome, so it primarily affects women. And so that got the attention going. She formed the National Organization for Rare Disorders, and they pushed. They developed this law, and it was pushed. The pharmaceutical company was against it. They said there's no problem here. They weren't for the law, and eventually it was passed. It's a complicated. It's a very long story, just that segment of it. But it was eventually signed into law by Ronald Reagan in 1983, and it's been a very successful law.
So what can you describe what the law is and like mechanically how it works?
So it's, again, there's several facets to it, but primarily they identified that pharmaceutical companies need to have a financial incentive to explore these small populations. First, they had to define the population, and they defined it as 200,000 people. This, I believe at the time, the population was around 200 million in the United States, so it was 1% of the population, something very small. And then they gave them, there's several incentives they give them, like they get relief from the fees for conducting clinical trials. The clinical trials can be shorter. They can have a smaller patient population, which makes sense because you're dealing with a smaller patient population. And the biggest one they get is they get market exclusivity for at least 7 years. So no competitor can be introduced into the market for 7 years. On top of that, there's other benefits and issues they get from it, but that made that piqued the pharmaceutical company's interest, and the initial companies went in were very small biotech companies, not the big companies that had been around a long time. They had no interest in it, and so the small ones went in and they started looking into these rare disorders and trying to find treatments.
Because so few less patients take the medication, are the medications very expensive?
Yes. So before the act was signed, I think there were 38 medications or treatments that had for a population that would be considered a rare or orphan population. Since that time, I think there are 600 approved now. I think there's over 1,000 if you count the ones that are currently in clinical trials and stuff like that. But the cost has gone up and up and up. One of the first big approvals was for a rare disorder called Gaucher disease, which is an inborn error of metabolism. They have a altered gene. They can't produce a certain protein, and it causes a bunch of problems in the body. They developed a way to deliver that enzyme back to the body. And at the time, it was $300,000 a year, and people were like, but now you have gene therapies reaching, some of them are $1 million, a couple million. So this has led, which was not the intent of the law, to blockbuster drugs. Bigger companies are getting interested in it because they're saying, hey, we can't make as much money with another hypertension drug or another ED drug or another drug for a common condition. And they're saying, wait a minute, there's a market here for us.
What about sickle cell? Is sickle cell considered a rare disease?
Sickle cell is, the estimates for how many people have a disorder, it's an inexact science. So I believe they're around 200,000, so they fall just under the threshold. There's a lot of interest in that market. I worked for a company that was working in there, and I mean, they had about 8 or 9 different companies that had a lot of different methods. They just had a gene therapy approved, but they have gene editing, which is we can talk about later. CRISPR, which is a way of correcting the defective gene.
Can we talk about that? Because sickle cell is a classic illness because it has one gene that's wrong.
Right.
And if you replace that gene, the patients get better.
Yes.
Can you talk a little about that?
So it's a monogenic gene, and it's one gene. You could have other genes that may influence the severity of the disorder, but basically, when you're born, you have what they call fetal hemoglobin, and you carry that with you for I forget how many years, and at some point, you start to develop adult cells, and when that happens, the cells are misshapen. They're sickle shaped, so they get caught. And that's why they get joint pain. That's why they get all the complications from the disorder. The cells break down prematurely, so the red blood cells break down. That's why sickle cell conveyed a protection against malaria, and that's why it's so common in people of African descent, because the red blood cells breaking down so fast. That's how malaria is carried through. So what they need to do is correct that underlying alteration to the gene. And fix it, and they have gene therapy. And gene therapy is one of the ways they figured out on how to do that. And we'll have to wait and see. It's been approved, but it's going to take time to see how effective it is.
Can you talk about that CRISPR technology?
So CRISPR is gene editing, and that's where they go in and you kind of cut the gene out, and you put the new corrected gene in. So in gene therapy, and not everyone actually that I meet is familiar with this, but the gene therapy is you're taking the corrected gene, the gene that's been in a lab, been corrected and fixed and infusing it into the body, and that corrected gene goes in and takes over. The big problem with gene therapy is how do you get it to all the cells of the body you need to get it to? What's the vector or the delivery method? And they came up with the fact that you use a virus. So they use a virus because what's a virus's role? It's to propagate itself and get into as many cells as possible. So they strip out the viral or dangerous component of it, and they put in the corrected gene and they send it. And then the gene has to take hold, and it has to work in the body, and it has to produce whatever the missing protein or enzyme that gene was supposed to produce. They have to produce that, and that's how it works. Gene editing, you're actually going in and cutting out the gene and putting in a new one to fix it. One of the theories they proposed for sickle cell was to actually take the healthy gene and shut it down so they never switch over from fetal hemoglobin. My caution with that would be, like, there's always the law of unintended consequences. How do you know that if you're taking that gene out that there isn't some role that you don't realize that it plays in the body? Because they don't understand what necessarily all the proteins that a gene produces, how and what it affects and what role it plays. So that's an interesting approach too.
Let me ask you about what are the most seen orphan disorders within the organization. So sickle cell, I would imagine, would be one.
Well, that's tough to say because some disorders that are very common fall under that $200,000 figure. So there's cystic fibrosis. So there's ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. Those are all fall under that. Most cancers are rare, and then you have what they're learning is. I worked for a brief amount of time with the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, and they would do these calls where they'd have the patients on, and the patients would call in and they'd say, "I have ADL positive CD40," and you realize that the treatments have to be that specific. So most cancers are rare, but yeah, cystic fibrosis, ALS, multiple sclerosis is kind of a diagnosis that a lot of times they'll say we're diagnosing you with multiple sclerosis because they can't figure out what it is. All the forms of muscular dystrophy would qualify as rare. They all fall under 200,000. So yeah, there's a lot of disorders that people have heard of qualify.
And then talk about some really rare disorders.
So, so this is interesting. One of the first. So when I was a medical writer at Nord, I did not handle calls when people called in to ask for information, but sometimes they got so busy they'd roll over to me. And this guy called in, and I couldn't hear what he was saying, so I kept raising my voice. And he said, "Please stop yelling. I said, "You said you can't hear me." He's like, "No, I have hyperacusis," which he hears extremely well. And he's like, "It's destroying my life. I hear everything," because his hearing was so significant, and he wanted to know, were there any treatments? There were no treatments for him at the time, and it was an exceedingly rare disorder. But the one that always stood out to me, there's a disorder called fibrodysplasia ossificans progressiva, and it has a related disorder called progressive osseous heteroplasia. And what it basically means is bone grows in parts of the body where it's not supposed to. It tends to get the coverage of it tends to be a little sensational, but they basically, when they experience trauma, and bone will grow in place, and then the doctors would try to cut the bone thinking it was a cancer, and the trauma of cutting it out would cause more bone to grow, and it affects the soft tissue, the ligaments, the tendons, and they would basically develop like almost a second skeleton, and it would, it's a fatal disorder. Sometimes they close up the throat, and that was one of the first disorders I worked in, and there are now 2 drugs that are in clinical trial for it, and that's mainly through the research and efforts of one doctor down at the University of Pennsylvania and his group, who worked for years and years and years to try to find a solution to that disorder.
We wanted to take a quick break to remind you about our sponsor, findagreatattorney.com. Dealing with the aftermath of an accident or injury can be overwhelming. And the last thing you want to worry about is finding the right lawyer. Findagreatattorney.com simplifies the process by connecting you with one of the top attorneys in your area who specializes in your specific type of case. Whether you've been injured in a car accident, suffered a slip and fall, or experienced medical malpractice, findagreatattorney.com has a network of experienced lawyers ready to help. And remember, their service is completely free, so you can focus on your recovery without worrying about the cost of legal representation. If you or someone you know needs legal assistance, don't hesitate to visit findagreatattorney.com and let them match you with one of the best lawyers in your area for your needs. I years ago did volunteer work for an organization. I was on the board of Dream Come True, and Dream Come True would grant wishes for children that had serious chronic or terminal illnesses. And we had one family come to us. I think it was called Frederick's Ataxia, where I guess their muscles would become so heavy that they would end up suffocating themselves or crushing their heart.
Yeah.
And 2 children in the same family had that disorder.
Yeah.
Do you know about Frederick's Ataxia?
I do. I have a friend. There's a documentary called The Ataxin. If you look it up, the basic. So one thing about rare disorders is, especially the ones that are one gene like sickle cell, if it'll overproduce a protein or underproduce it, but you may have different percentages the individual person. So a lot of times the severity of the disorder varies from one person to the other, and it can vary even in the same family. 2 kids have the same disorder. They can have widely various expressions. One of the main symptoms of Frederick's ataxia is muscle weakness, and my friend was an athlete and guy, and he found out that he was going to lose the ability to walk. And he works. There's a couple organizations that are dedicated to Frederick's ataxia. They just had a drug approved over the last year through the Orphan Drug Act to treat that. But he has a documentary. He did a ride across the country in a recombinant bike with 3 other people, and it's one of those where you ride. Someone's always riding, and then the others are sleeping in a van. It's a race. I think it's called the Race Across America, but he did a race across America for that. And they raised money, and they just had their first drug approved.
Has AI changed anything about the rare diseases? Has it advanced research or helped you to get the word out, or has done anything to change things?
I'm not familiar of AI's impact in the rare disease world. I'm not involved directly enough in research to know if that'll be helpful to them. So no, I don't know the answer to that yet.
Okay, how about funding? Where does NORD get its funding from?
Well, NORD is a membership organization, both individual members and organizational members. NORD has part of NORD's company is the medications assistance program. I was not involved with that, but they run programs. So one of the ways pharmaceutical companies try to address the fact that these drugs cost a lot of money, and if people don't have insurance, then it can be you can't afford them. They have a program set up to give compassionate use to people where they'll give them the drugs for free or find a way to help them get the drug. NORD administers that program because the assessment of someone's case has to be done by an objective party. It can't be decided by the pharmaceutical company. And so I know they run those programs, and they're paid for those to run them. So I don't know. I'm sure that they have a lot of programs and other ways that they raise money as well.
So if I'm a parent and I have a son or a daughter that's sick or different, and I'm thinking maybe there's a rare disease here, right? What would you suggest that they do? Actually, they went through the process. They went to multiple doctors, and nobody's helping them. So there might be something different in this kid. What would you recommend them to do at that point?
I think what they call umbrella organizations, that's what NORD is. It doesn't focus on one specific disorder. It focuses on all rare disorders. They have ways of moving forward so you can try to get to see a specialist or find a doctor who will make that referral that they need. So NORD can help with that. There's other organizations like Global Genes and that do kind of the same work. And my advice would be to ask your primary care physician saying, hey, there seems to be something here. Can we get a referral to a specialist? And then if they can't, try to get to those organizations.
So it's funny you would say that, because I was just talking with a friend of mine whose son is experiencing some challenges, and they've been to multiple doctors, multiple specialists, and they kind of contradict each other. They don't know what's going on. She's at her wit's end about what's going on with their son. So one suggestion is they could call an organization such as NORD and describe the symptoms and then say, where could I go?
NORD can't do that, but they may give them some advice on how to handle that type of situation. Unfortunately, the first thing they do now is they do what's called whole exome sequencing, but maybe the insurance company or the doctors don't want to do that. And so the exome is the protein producing part of the genome. Those are usually the disorders that are affected, or the genes that are affected in a rare disorder or in a rare genetic disorder. And they'll go through and test all the drugs or test all the genes to see if there is an alteration for it. Sometimes they'll do it and they'll find out, hey, this is the first time we've ever seen an alteration in this gene. I know of families who they've done that testing and they say, we don't know anyone else who's ever had this mutation. I have to remember the guy's name. He did that test and they said, you're the only person we've ever heard of. Your child is the only person who had this alteration to the gene. He went on to social media and said, wouldn't you know it, someone responded and said, no, our child has that. And then it turned out more people that his name is Matthew Might, but I can't remember what the disorder is. But he was able to contact the testing organizations and say, can you contact anyone who's got that and say that, and he formed an organization. And it turned out that, it's an extremely rare, it's probably fewer than 50 people, but there was a lot more people than they realize. And one of the things people have to understand is if a medical research doesn't write about like if they find, if you find a new mutation, you're probably going to write about it and send it to a medical journal. So like the New England Journal of Medicine, they don't really profile rare disorders as much, but there's a whole bunch like the American Journal of Medical Genetics, Nature magazine. So if it's not written, and it's not necessarily going to show up. So people might not know that that's why it's so hard to determine the numbers of how many people have a rare disorder.
And I also know of somebody that they grew up in a foreign country. They came to the United States and they were having problems with memory and balance and things. And they did so many tests and they eventually found out that this individual had a parasite, a worm, that was leached or attached to their brain. And they ended up treating this in a way they have never treated anything like this before, with a poison to the parasite and cutting open the brain. And it's just so fascinating that, like you said, this individual found out they had this situation that nobody else had heard of.
Yeah, it's sometimes it takes a little bit of serendipity. So there's this is very uncommon, but there was a story I read. I don't know the woman. But she had multiple sclerosis, and she had cerebral palsy. She had difficulty walking. She was wheelchair, and she went to see a doctor for a different reason. And the doctor, I believe, may have been Japanese, and the doctor said, I don't think you have cerebral palsy. I think you have this. It's a rare form of. It's called Sagawa disease, which is named after the researcher. I guess a disorder where there's a neurotransmitter is not being produced and stuff like that. And he's like, it's treatable. And she's like, no, I have cerebral palsy. That's it. And her husband found out and said, well, why don't you at least go and get tested? And she's like, no, I have cerebral. Like what? There's nothing that can be done. And she went, got tested, and she had the altered gene. It's very uncommon for a neurological disorder to have a treatment because once neurological damage happens, it's very difficult to fix. She took the treatment, which was basically L-Dopa, which is I think it's L-Dopa, which is commonly used to treat movement disorders. And the next thing you know, she found out that she could stand to wait for her kids to come out to the car, and then she could walk. And then they went back to Hawaii for their honeymoon, and she was able to walk to all the places when she had to have been carried. And if she hadn't happened to meet that particular doctor who knew of this very rare, very uncommon disorder, which is more common in Japan, she would have thought she had cerebral palsy her whole life.
And I think that was the drug that was used in that Robin Williams movie with Robert De Niro, where he prescribed this. He was catatonic, Robert De Niro.
Yeah.
And they prescribed that medicine, and all of a sudden he was, very lively and very animated.
Yes, I haven't.
Awakenings, I think.
I haven't seen that one and stuff.
Fascinating.
But another kind of success story of orphan drugs is there's a movie called Extreme Measures, which stars Harrison Ford, and that profiles a man named John Crowley who. I don't know if it's one or both of his children were diagnosed with a rare metabolic disorder, Pompe disease. There's no treatment for it. And he started his own company. It's called Amicus Therapeutics, and he started it to pursue the therapy for his kids. And they've had at least one, maybe a couple drugs that have been approved over the years, but that was profiled there. And we're starting to see a lot of people are saying, we're going to do the initial research ourselves and then show it's effective and then try to get the biotech company or something involved in it. So, yeah, it's I have to see Awakenings. That's probably a good movie.
So do you know of any other success stories you could share with us?
Yeah, the gene therapy just got approved for an eye disorder, which they think can help restore their sight.
Really?
Yeah, for
somebody who's blind can restore their sight.
Yeah, I know it's Leber's congenital amaurosis, so I don't know if they're blind, but I know that they have visual problems, so it may be improving their visions. But I know that I know that if there's a genetic cause, I think they feel that it can fix it. I might have to double check that one. But I know that they're testing some for certain forms of congenital deafness that are genetic, where they think they may be able to restore or improve hearing. I'm trying to think of a lot of these treatments for these that have been approved are the only therapy or treatment that the disorder has. So without it, most of the treatment is either palliative or it's just supportive. And so that's why it's important.
So you're also a medical writer.
Yes.
So could you talk to us about what that is, what you write about, how you get your information, what you share, who that goes to?
So most of my work is patient education. So that's where I'm taking the technical terminology out of the medical terminology, making it understandable for the patient audience. I worked for NORD for 5 years, but I worked as a freelance capacity for them for over 20. And what I do is I go in and I'd research the disorders. I'd write the report. It gets sent out to a medical professional who often had a clinical interest in the disorder. They review it, and it would be added to the NORD database. So someone got a diagnosis. A lot of times they'll get a diagnosis, of a rare disorder, and they'll just get handed a piece of paper, and then people will go on the internet and look it up. And so a lot of it was very technical at the time I started, and so this NORD offered a way to have it presented in a way that was understandable for the patient.
So what are some examples of things that you've written about or are currently going to write about?
I've written about the muscular dystrophies. I've written about disorders in every, especially I've written about kidney disorders, about, multi-system disorders. I'm trying to think of a couple. That initial bone disorder was one that really stood out. I can't think of anything. I'm drawing a blank for some reason.
Any stories that are of great interest to, for example, our viewing public?
The interesting thing is when I wrote those reports about the rare bone disorder, there were two, and the one had only been diagnosed, I think, in 13 people in the country at the time. And my boss said she had met a woman at a conference, and she said her 2 boys had it. And I'm writing this report, and I'm reading the literature, and it has occurred in 11 women and 2 boys. And I walked into her office, and I said, "You said her sons have it." And she goes, "Yeah." And I said, "But the medical literature said only 2 boys have ever been identified with this disorder." And she goes, "Yeah, those are her sons that they're talking about in the medical literature." And I was like, "Oh," I'm like, it didn't register. One of the things I tell, which is probably, I tell it a lot, so it's probably a story, and I think it's important. NORD had patient-family conferences, and when I was there, again, the internet was relatively new, and so these patients would show up with their families, and the kids sometimes had never met another kid that had the same disorder they have.
Wow.
Or they had never been in a room where other kids also were dealing with medical challenges, so they didn't stand out like they might have stood out there. And these kids would play and they'd run around, and I'm a guy in my 20s looking at these kids who have these challenges, and their attitude and how positive they were and their outlook. I always tell people it was extremely humbling, and it was like, how can they maintain that positive an attitude when they're facing it? But that's what a lot of these families deal with it, and the thing that always brought me back was that they're dealing with really difficult situations and difficult challenges, but they work together. The story of NORD is working together to formulate these treatments, and the way the family and the way the kids remain positive and work positively was pretty remarkable.
I think the amazing takeaway about the NORD story that you told was you have this self-proclaimed mother in Connecticut.
Yeah.
And if you're a mother or you're a father and you have a child that has some type of challenge and you hit a lot of roadblocks, you might think, well, what can I do? And this woman takes it upon herself, this mother, to go out and spearhead legislation that changes completely the landscape for orphan disorders and orphan drugs, and then forms an entity or a company that has to have such far-reaching positive impacts on so many people and so many families. And for people that are sitting there thinking, what can I do?
Yeah.
This is the perfect example of what you can do.
Yeah, and it's an interesting story on that being the self-proclaimed, mother. One of the people she worked with to help in the beginning is Woody Guthrie's widow. Why am I drawing a blank on her name? I'm drawing a blank on her name, but Woody. So Woody Guthrie was the famous folk singer.
Alice's Restaurant.
Yeah, he had Huntington's disease. They thought he was an alcoholic, and they put him in a mental institution. But he had a rare disorder called Huntington's disease. A lot of people know it because it's the one where there's no treatment, and it's autosomal dominant, which means there's a 50-50 chance that it's passed to the child.
She say something also.
Yeah.
It gets expressed later.
Yes.
It gets expressed in your 40s and 50s,
50s.
and you already have your children.
Yeah.
So you can't you can't decide, I shouldn't have any children because I have this rare disease.
Yeah.
So it ends up going to the next generation. Even though you might not want it to.
Right. And so, but she worked with the woman, and the woman explained to her, but the woman said to her, why, when I go to an older congressperson's office, I'm Woody Guthrie's widow, but when I go to a younger one, I'm Arlo Guthrie's mother. So she understood that you had to engage people a certain way. And then she was very, very well versed in the science, but when she was in the office, she'd say, I don't really understand. Can you explain it to me? So Abby learned to go in the office and say, well, I'm just a mother from Connecticut. Can you explain that to me? Even though she knew a lot more and understood a lot more. So she was able to do that to effectively lobby, effectively engage with policymakers and other people. It is a remarkable story, and it is a remarkable story, the amount of good that they've accomplished.
And when you think about somebody who can be a very powerful advocate, I can't think of anyone more powerful than a mother who has a sick child who's being told there's nothing else we can do to help your child. Yeah. And then all of a sudden that fight or flight instinct comes in, and it's like, no, I'm this mama bear, and I'm going to do whatever I need to do to make sure that my child is protected and gets well. And I think it's such a beautiful story, and it's so inspirational. Yeah,
and she ran the organization for a long time. Before she retired. She did great work. The organization does great work. It's a community that does a lot of good work and supports each other. And I'm happy for whatever small contribution I've contributed to it. I think very highly of her, and I think very highly of the people in that organization and the people in that community. And I just think if you're a mother sitting in Iowa with a child that has some rare disorder, and that you're able to connect with NORD, and then you're able to come to Connecticut, and you're able to meet other families and other children, that all of a sudden it's like a lifeline. It was something. When the calls would sometimes roll over to me when I was a writer, someone would say to me, NORD had a networking program. This kind of got supplanted by the internet because people could connect via the internet. But they would call and say, well, I have this, my son has this diagnosis. The doctor says there's only 12 people in the country who have this disorder. And I said, well, we have 30 people in our database who have this disorder who've written to us. We can put you in touch with them. They're like, no, the doctor said there's only 12. And I said, no, there's like 30. I'm like, we can send you the names. And they're like, because it was before the internet. And so, again, if it wasn't reported in the medical journals, you had no way of knowing it. And so it does a lot. It brought people together. And I can't imagine what it would mean for someone who is alone, or they're the only person in their area that has this type of disorder, to know that, hey, they're not alone. Hey, there's other people facing the same challenges as you. Hey, you can, there's someone who understands what you're going through and how important that is to people. And sometimes just to be acknowledged and see that you're not alone, you're not the only person struggling through whatever your challenge is at the time. So. What was the most rewarding part of your work there? Someone wrote to me. Someone wrote to me once. I'm trying to remember if she called or she wrote to me. No, she called, and then the front people asked me, did you write this report? And I said, yeah, I wrote it. And she said, well, this woman's on the phone. She wants to talk to you. It was a young woman. And I'm like, okay. And she goes, did you write this report? And I'm like, yeah, I wrote it. She's like, I just want to thank you. You don't know what it means to me. And I said, it's just a report. I took the words. It's my job. And she's like, you don't understand. I take it and I carry it in my purse. And I take it out to show people that I'm not a freak.
Wow.
And her condition, her eyes didn't track. So if I was talking to you but wanted to look at you, she'd have to kind of whip her head to bring her eyes. And I said I couldn't believe it. And she's like, nowhere else was there somewhere that explained it in a way that was understandable. And so she literally carried that report around with her so people understood that why she had to be the way she was. And that was remarkable.
I guess, are there any myths that you could share that involve rare disorders? And I think that was the great intro to a myth, and that is people think that this woman is, I think using your words, a freak, or is so odd that, people look at her differently than if she shows them, here's an article that says exactly what I have.
So collectively, they estimate around 30 million people in the U.S. have rare disorders collectively. A lot of them are underdiagnosed, so the number's pretty high, and it puts it pretty high on I think it puts it in the top 10 as a group of conditions affecting people. The biggest myth is that what they've learned is researching these rare disorders somehow can benefit more common disorders, and they may have implications in more common diseases. And the pursuit of gene therapy, the pursuit of these may affect more common diseases. I think that's the biggest myth, is that we're all still connected. We're all still, what's done for the rare disease community can have positive impacts for broader disorders. So the myth was that there wasn't a reason to go in there. But there's a famous quote by a doctor, and the paraphrase it says, "Exploring where nature's and life's mysteries are less commonly expressed, like rare disorders could hold key secrets to more common things." So that's probably the biggest one.
So what's interesting and on a personal level is that somebody in my family had long QT syndrome, and it's a condition that affects the heart. And they did testing, and they determined that syndactyly, which is webbing of the toes, it's a specialized gene that has something to do with long QT. And they wanted family members to go in and be tested. So out of my 3 children, 2 of them have syndactyly. And my brother has syndactyly. And my children's grandfather has syndactyly. So it's so interesting to find out things that you would never, connect this to that. They're now looking at different things that might not otherwise appear to anyone.
Yeah, so the way that works, they're called it's like a multi-system disorder. So you have an altered gene. It either produces maybe too much or too little of a protein, or maybe it produces an ineffective form of it. That protein might have a role in the heart, it might have a role in the skin, it might have a role in bone formation, it might have a role in blood cell. Like it could have a role in multiple different systems of the body, and if it does, then you'll get what seemingly seems to be completely unrelated or disparate symptoms, but they're all still caused by the lack or overproduction or improper production of a protein.
So as our time is nearing an end here, I just wanted to find out if there's anything that you would like to share with our viewing audience about anything that we've discussed so far.
If you have the whole story of how the Orphan Drug Act got passed, it's AbbieSMyers.com. Abby wrote a book. I know the ghostwriter personally, who helped her with it. And it's available online. You can download it for free as a PDF if you want to learn more about that. You can research from some of the rare disease organizations like the National Organization for Rare Disorders. There is the month of February is Rare Disease Month, and there's a lot of a lot of organizations do programming and events and stuff around rare disorders. So if you wanted to find a way to support somehow, keep your eye open in February for that. I think all the progress that's made in rare disorders, I think it will have long-term lasting positive effect in more common diseases. And you'll probably be seeing more of it because the intent of the law was not to produce these blockbuster drugs, and they are becoming more and more expensive. And like everything else in life, there's got to be a point where the insurance companies and the pharmaceutical industry and the government is going to have to address these things again. And so you'll probably be seeing that in the news. But just remember that there are families who are there are about 7,000 rare disorders by estimate. It's growing. Most do not have a treatment or a therapy. So there's still a lot of work to be done in that community.
And what is your company?
And mine is Orphan Communications. So to reiterate from the beginning, orphan is the term they use for people who had rare disorders or drugs that were used for people with rare disorders because no one would take them in because they didn't figure it'd be profitable for small populations. So I do a lot of work with medical nonprofits and pharmaceutical companies. I also do work with former NORD employees that I worked with at the time that we do consulting work, and we work on patient advocacy, which is helping to get the patient's voice into the clinical trial process, and which is extremely important in the rare disease world because when you're a pharmaceutical company and you're trying to get a clinical trial done for a rare disorder, it's harder. There's fewer patient populations to bring in. So you have a smaller number of people to get in. So it's really important that they be active in their own care. And if you have more than one pharmaceutical company working on a treatment, then you can imagine they may be competing for patients, and it gets really complicated.
And how can people reach out to you or contact you?
I have a website, orphancommunications.com, and they can reach out to me through that.
Terrific. Rob Tomeno, thank you so much.
Guys, thank you very much for having me.